At 4 a.m. in Philadelphia, one of the most powerful men in the city stepped out of a private meeting and saw a young woman kneeling in front of a convenience store, counting coins under the fluorescent light, trying to buy a carton of milk for her little sister. Just outside, an 8-year-old girl slept curled up on the concrete step, clutching a worn sketchbook like it was the last thing she had in the world. He walked away. 30 steps later, he stopped, because that child awakened a memory he had buried for 8 years. And what happened next changed all of their lives forever. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. Every comment you leave keeps us going and inspires us to bring you more stories. Let's begin. 5 hours before that moment, Sterling Vaughn was sitting at the head of a long table in a private room on the second floor of Bellini, a restaurant in Rittenhouse, Philadelphia. 11 o'clock at night. 6 men sat across from him, each one richer than 90% of the city, but not one of them dared open his mouth before Sterling opened his. Low golden lights hung over the table, shining down on the folders arranged neatly in front of each man. Sterling didn't look at the files. He looked at each face, slowly, one after another, like a man taking inventory of his own property. Raymond Goss, the largest construction contractor in the Northeast, raised his hand to ask permission to speak. Sterling lifted one finger. Raymond stopped in the middle of his sentence, his mouth still open, but no sound came out anymore. The whole room waited. Sterling turned one page of the file and read in silence. Then he folded it closed and pushed it lightly toward Raymond. "Your project is 5 months behind schedule, Mr. Goss." Sterling's voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. In this room, his whisper carried more weight than anyone else's shout. Raymond began to explain. The permits had been delayed. The suppliers had changed their prices. The weather last month hadn't been favorable. Sterling listened without nodding, without objecting, without showing any expression at all. That kind of silence was more dangerous than any reprimand. When Raymond stopped speaking, Sterling said, in the same voice, at the same measured pace, 60 days. You have exactly 60 days. Raymond swallowed. If I'm sitting at this table next month and still have to mention this matter, then the man sitting in your chair won't be you. No one in the room looked at Raymond, not because they lacked manners, but because looking would mean admitting that they, too, could fall into that position at any moment. Raymond took the folder with both hands. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the folder, just enough for the man sitting nearby to notice. Sterling stood up. He didn't say another word. The 6 men stood with him, all at once, like a reflex long since trained into them. Sterling walked out through the rear door. Barrett Crane was waiting downstairs in the lobby, a coat folded over one arm, a phone tucked against his shoulder. When he saw Sterling, Barrett ended the call and opened the car door. "Donatello, 15 minutes, Sterling said, sliding into the back seat. The black car slipped away from the curb and merged into the river of Philadelphia's nightlights. Barrett looked through the rearview mirror. Goss will finish it. Sterling looked out through the window, the city passing before his eyes like something he had bought a long time ago but had never truly inhabited. "I know," he said, "because fear is always more punctual than a bonus." The car turned onto Walnut Street, heading toward the next closed-door meeting. The meeting after which, at 4 o'clock in the morning, Sterling Vaughn would step outside and see a girl kneeling in front of a convenience store, counting coins in the rain. 3 weeks before that night, on an afternoon near the end of October, Patrice Dolan drove a rental car through the streets of Kensington with the Mercer sisters sitting in the back seat. Jo sat close to the door, her hands holding her backpack on her lap. Blythe sat in the middle, her sketchbook open across her knees, her pencil still shading the roof of a house she hadn't finished. Patrice stopped the car in front of a 4-story brown brick building, its wall paint almost completely peeled away, a rusted fire escape zigzagging along the side. "Temporary housing," Patrice said, without turning around. "I'll get everything sorted, then we'll figure out what comes next." The apartment was on the 3rd floor. 1 bedroom, 1 small living room connected to the kitchen, yellowed walls, cold tile floors. Patrice pulled 2 mattresses out of the built-in closet and laid them on the bedroom floor, brought blankets up from the trunk of the car, and arranged the pillows. That night, Patrice made instant noodles for all 3 of them. She sat at the folding table in the kitchen, talking as if everything were normal, asking Blythe how the new school was, asking Jo whether she wanted to look for work nearby. Her voice was gentle, steady, like someone who had practiced lying long enough that she no longer had to make an effort. Jo watched Patrice through the whole meal, not saying much, but not asking anything either. She was used to Patrice changing plans without explaining why. After Blythe washed the dishes, she went to sleep, hugging her sketchbook, her head resting on the pillow, her eyes closed before Joe had time to turn off the light. Joe lay beside her sister, listening to Patrice in the kitchen, the sound of running water, the sound of a cabinet door being locked, then silence. Joe didn't know when she drifted off. The next morning, Joe opened her eyes because sunlight was slipping through the thin curtain. The living room was empty. The kitchen was empty. Patrice's coffee mug was upside down on the rack, washed clean, dry, as if no one had ever used it. On the folding table, an apartment key sat beside a white envelope. Inside the envelope were 4 $100 bills and a scrap of paper torn from a notebook. The handwriting rushed. "You can take care of yourself. I'm sorry." Joe stood in the middle of the kitchen, holding the note with both hands. She checked her purse. The old phone Patrice had bought her 3 months earlier was gone. Patrice had bought it, so Patrice had taken it back. The key to the old house in Bridgeport was gone too, because Patrice had returned the house the week before. Joe opened the refrigerator. Empty. Not a bottle of water, not a single egg. She looked toward the bedroom. Blythe was still asleep, lying on her side, both arms wrapped around her sketchbook against her chest, her face peaceful, her breathing even. Joe sat down on the kitchen floor, her back against the refrigerator. She opened the envelope and counted the money again. $400. Rent for this apartment was $850 a month. She folded the money, slipped it into the inside pocket of her coat, and zipped it closed. She didn't cry. She didn't call anyone. She only started calculating. 400 divided by 30 days. $13 a day for 2 people. And she began there. Now, 3 weeks later, in the black car leaving Walnut Street at 4:15 in the morning, Sterling Vaughn sat in the back seat, his eyes fixed straight ahead. Barrett drove, waiting. "Find out for me," Sterling said, the girl in the convenience store, and the child sitting beside her. Barrett didn't ask why. After 9 years of working with Sterling, he knew the difference between an ordinary order and a moment that made Sterling change direction. He nodded, took out his phone, and started making calls. At the same time, in front of the convenience store, Joe gently shook Blythe's shoulder. On that specific night, the old neighbor had fallen ill, leaving Joe with no choice but to bring her little sister along to her grueling shift. Blythe opened her eyes in a daze, her hand still holding her sketchbook. On the sketchbook, a neatly folded black suit jacket lay over the page, shielding it from the rain. Joe looked at the jacket, then looked around. The sidewalk was empty, the streetlight flickered. There was no one there. The black car had been gone for a long time. Joe picked up the suit jacket, folded it, and stuffed it into her backpack. "Who gave us the jacket?" Blythe asked, her voice still heavy with sleep. "I don't know. Walk fast." Joe zipped the backpack, slung it over her shoulder, and took Blythe's hand. The two sisters stepped into the Kensington street, just as dawn began to pale the sky. One small shadow and one larger shadow trailing each other along the wet sidewalk, heading back toward the third-floor apartment, where $400 was shrinking day by day. On the third day after Patrice left, Joe took Blythe to the cheapest market, a 40-minute walk from the apartment. Blythe walked beside her sister, her sketchbook tucked under one arm, her eyes looking at the shelves that rose far above her head without asking for anything. Joe held the plastic basket and placed one item into it at a time. A pack of noodles, a loaf of white bread, a carton of fresh milk, a can of beans. She counted every cent in her head, adding and subtracting and adding, like a chess player who knew that one wrong move would cost the entire board. When they reached the food aisle, Joe reached up for a jar of peanut butter, $3.75. She held it in her hand, looked at the price, then looked into the basket. The total was already $42. The money left in her coat pocket was $358. Divided across 27 more days, Joe put the jar of peanut butter back on the shelf. On the way to the checkout counter, she passed the stationery aisle. Blythe was looking at a box of 12 colored pencils, placed on the lowest shelf, right at her eye level. Blythe didn't point. She didn't ask. She only looked, the way a child looks when she has already learned not to want out loud. $4. Joe picked up the box of pencils and placed it in the basket without saying a word. At the checkout counter, Blythe saw the pencils lying beside the bag of food. She looked up at Joe, her eyes round, not understanding. Joe lifted the grocery bag onto her shoulder and handed the box of pencils to Blythe. "You need to draw. I need you to draw." Blythe held the box of pencils with both hands, carefully, like someone receiving something worth more than the price printed on the label. That night, in the Kensington apartment, Blythe sat on the floor mattress, opened her sketchbook, and pulled out the green pencil first. The little girl drew slowly, her head tilted, her lip caught between her teeth. A small house with a triangle roof, a tree on the left, its round crown colored in deep green. 2 people standing in front of the house, one tall and one small, holding hands. Joe sat at the folding table, pretending to read a job flyer, though she was really watching her sister draw. When Blythe finished, she tore off a piece of tape from the roll Joe had bought at the market, stood on her toes, and taped the drawing to the empty refrigerator door. Then she stepped back, looked at it, and tilted her head to the right. The refrigerator was still empty inside, but on the outside, it had a house. The 12th day. Joe put on the only shirt she owned that wasn't wrinkled, and went to 3 interviews. The cafe in Center City turned her down because Joe didn't have a valid permanent address. The laundromat on the corner of Lehigh turned her down because she had no guarantor. The 3rd place was a restaurant downtown. The manager looked at Joe and asked about her experience. Joe answered briefly. 3 years waiting tables in Bridgeport. Washing dishes, carrying food, clearing tables. I can do everything except cook. The manager tapped his pen against the table. Night shift. 10 o'clock at night to 5 o'clock in the morning. Lower pay than the day shift. Start Monday. The night shift meant Blythe would be alone after 10 o'clock at night. Joe knew that. She knew it was wrong. But $300 wouldn't last until the end of the month. "I'll take it," Joe said. Her voice didn't shake. Her hands, hidden behind her back, did. Joe knocked on the apartment at the end of the 3rd-floor hallway, where an old woman lived alone and often left her door cracked open every afternoon. She was the only person in the building who had ever nodded hello to Joe when the 2 sisters moved in. Joe asked directly, without circling around it. $10 a night, to let Blythe sleep in her room from 10 o'clock at night until 6 o'clock in the morning. The old woman looked at Joe and didn't ask about her circumstances, didn't ask where her parents were. She only nodded and said, "Bring the child's pillow over." Every night from then on, Blythe carried her pillow and her sketchbook to the old woman's room, her mismatched socks dragging softly along the hallway floor. The old woman taught Blythe to knit a scarf from leftover yarn, the 2 of them sitting beneath the desk lamp until Blythe drifted off to sleep. Every morning, Joe picked her sister up at 6 o'clock, before Blythe had time to wake. That system ran on pure willpower. $13 a day. $10 for the neighbor. $3 for everything else. 2 days after the night Joe counted coins outside the convenience store in Rittenhouse, Barrett placed a thin file on Sterling's desk. Sterling opened it, skimmed through it, then stopped at one line. Barrett spoke plainly. "Blythe Mercer, 8 years old. No legal guardian. If social services find out, the sisters will be separated." Sterling closed the file. He picked up the phone and called a number. The manager of the restaurant where Joe worked answered, and his voice changed at once when he realized who was calling. Sterling said only one sentence. "Move her to the day shift." No explanation. No need for one. A man who owed Sterling Vaughn a favor didn't ask why. He only asked when. The next day, Joe arrived at the restaurant and was told she had been moved to the day shift, 8 o'clock in the morning to 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The manager said it was because of an internal schedule change. Joe didn't believe him, but she had no reason to refuse. That night, for the first time in 3 weeks, Joe lay on the floor mattress in the Kensington apartment, Blythe lying beside her, the sketchbook tucked between them. Joe listened to her sister's breathing, soft, even, and in the dark, for the first time in 21 days, she closed her eyes without having to set an alarm for 4 o'clock in the morning. 1 week after her shift was changed, Joe went to the market alone at noon. Blythe was at school and got out at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, so Joe had enough time to buy groceries and then pick her up. She carried a cloth bag and walked along Allegheny Street, the weak November sunlight filtering through the old awnings. Inside the bag were 2 loaves of bread, 1 can of beans, and 1 carton of milk. She was turning into the shortcut alley back to the apartment when 2 men stepped out from a car parked close to the curb, blocking her path. One of them asked, his voice casual, as if he were asking for directions, "Patrice Dolan, do you know where she is?" Joe stopped, her hand tightening around the strap of the cloth bag. "I don't know anyone named Patrice." The second man looked at Joe, not aggressive, but clearly not intending to leave either. "She owes us. She said your family would take care of it." Joe looked straight into the man's eyes. "I don't have any family to take care of anything, and I don't know where she is." She stepped to the right and walked around the two men, fast but not running, because running would tell them she was afraid. She walked straight ahead, her back upright, without turning around, until she reached the building entrance, climbed the stairs, entered the apartment, locked the door, and slid the bolt into place. Then she stood with her back against the door, both hands still holding the grocery bag, and breathed. That afternoon, Joe picked Blythe up at the school gate, smiled, and asked what she had learned that day. She didn't mention a single word about the two men. That night, after Blythe had fallen asleep, Joe lay staring at the ceiling, calculating. Patrice owed someone money. That debt wasn't Joe's, but debt collectors didn't care whose name was written on the note. They cared whose name was on the mailbox. "And the mailbox on the ground floor," said Mercer. That same night, Barrett received a call from the network. The information was brief. Two men belonged to Vic Harlan's crew, a loan shark operation working around North Philadelphia. Patrice Dolan owed Harlan $23,000. Barrett called Sterling at 10 o'clock at night. After Sterling listened, he was silent for a while. Barrett asked carefully, "What does this have to do with you?" Sterling didn't answer that question. He said, "Find out exactly how much Patrice Dolan owes, and how many men Vic Harlan has sent into Kensington." Barrett hung up, understanding that his question had just been answered by the very way Sterling had avoided it. 2 days later, Barrett placed a single sheet of paper in front of Sterling. On it were Vic Harlan's name, the address of a bar in North Philadelphia, and the number, $23,000. Sterling finished reading, folded the paper, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. "Arrange the car. Tonight." Barrett looked at Sterling, waiting for more. Sterling said nothing else. Barrett understood. He called the driver and one other man, telling both of them to wait at the end of the street, not to follow, not to go inside, not to do anything unless Sterling called. Barrett wanted to object. North Philadelphia wasn't Vaughn territory. Vic Harlan's bar was Vic's own ground, the kind of place where every unfamiliar face was noticed before that person had time to sit down. But Barrett had followed Sterling long enough to know when to speak and when to have a lawyer ready. 9 o'clock at night. The black car stopped at the end of Cumberland Street. Sterling opened the door and stepped out. Black suit jacket, white shirt, no tie. He walked a short distance along the cracked sidewalk, past a laundromat that had already closed, past a grocery store with its metal shutters pulled down, and stopped in front of a bar with no sign, only a dull yellow light hanging over the wooden doorframe. Sterling pushed the door open and went inside. The bar wasn't large. A long counter on the left, a few round tables on the right, low-hanging lights, a thin layer of cigarette smoke drifting at eye level. 7 or 8 people were scattered around the room, beer glasses in front of them, country music playing softly from an old speaker on a shelf. When Sterling crossed the threshold, the conversation didn't die at once. It faded, one table at a time, like a tide pulling back. The bartender looked up, the glass he was wiping, stopping halfway in his hand. 2 men sitting near the door turned their chairs to look, then looked at each other, then stopped looking. Within 10 seconds, the bar was silent. No one knew exactly who Sterling Vaughn was, but everyone recognized what he brought into the room. Power didn't need to introduce itself. It only needed to step inside, and the air would change on its own. Vic Harlan was sitting at the last table, in the farthest corner, his back against the wall. 50 years old, broad-faced, red-faced, the kind of man used to shouting and used to being obeyed. His right hand held a glass of whiskey. His left hand rested on the table. When Vic looked up and realized who was walking toward him, the whiskey glass stopped halfway to his mouth. Vic's eyes changed. Not fear, not yet fear, but the very fast calculation of a man who had just understood that he had accidentally put his hand on something belonging to someone he shouldn't have touched. When Vic sent 2 men to Kensington to collect Patrice Dolan's debt, he hadn't known Sterling Vaughn had any connection to the Mercer family. Patrice owed money. Patrice had said she had family in Philadelphia. Vic sent men to ask. Standard procedure. But now, the Vaughn boss was standing inside Vic's bar, alone, without guards. And that meant only one thing. Sterling hadn't come to negotiate. He had come to inform. Sterling pulled out the chair across from Vic and sat down. No one invited him, but when Sterling decided where to sit, that chair became his. He placed a white envelope on the table between them. His right hand rested lightly on top of it, not pushing it across. "Patrice Dolan," Sterling said. Vic set the whiskey glass down slowly. "She owes me." "I didn't ask who she owes," Sterling said. "I came to tell you that you won't collect anymore." Vic looked at the envelope, looked at Sterling, then tried to laugh. The kind of laugh a man uses when he's looking for an exit and hasn't found one yet. "Vaughn, 23,000 isn't a small amount." "Correct. And you sent men to question a 27-year-old girl on her way home from the market." Vic said nothing. The smile faded. "That girl doesn't owe you 1 cent, Sterling said, his voice still low, still even. Not a single word rising higher than the one before it. "But you sent 2 men to stop her on the street, asking her to pay for someone who had already disappeared." Sterling leaned forward, only enough for Vic to feel the distance between them shrink. "My courtesy has limits, Mr. Harlan. Today I brought an envelope. Inside it is the full 23,000. You take it, you pull your men back, and this ends." Sterling pushed the envelope toward Vic, then stood, buttoning his suit jacket with one hand, slowly, calmly, like a man in no hurry, because he knew no one would dare do anything while he was still standing there. "If I hear the name Mercer from the mouth of anyone in your organization one more time," Sterling said, looking straight into Vic's eyes, "the next time I come, I won't bring an envelope." He turned his back, walked past the silent tables, pushed the door open into the dark street, and vanished into the night. The bar stayed silent for almost another half-minute after the door closed. Vic Harlan sat alone, opened the envelope, and counted. It was all there. His breath hitched slightly as he stacked the bills again, not because of the money, but because he had just looked into the eyes of a man he knew, with absolute certainty, that if he hadn't brought money, the conversation would have ended with something no one would want to repeat. Vic folded the envelope, slipped it into his jacket pocket, drained his whiskey glass, and called the 2 men he had sent to Kensington. "Pull back. Don't go back. Don't ask anything else." 3 days later, Allegheny Street was quiet again. Jo came home from the market by the same old route. No one blocked her way. No one asked about Patrice. She didn't know why. She only knew that for the first time in a week, she walked down the street without having to glance over her shoulder. Barrett wasn't a curious man. After 9 years of working for Sterling Vaughn, he had learned that curiosity was a luxury, and in this world, luxuries usually came at a high price. But when Barrett dug deeper into the Mercer family file to prepare Joe's legal documents, he found a name that shouldn't have been there. Dale Mercer. That name appeared in an old file Barrett kept in the office safe, a file with a yellowed handwritten label. Vaughn. Barrett sat at his desk, opened the old file, read it again, then opened Joe's file beside it. He compared the names, compared the dates, compared the addresses. Then he closed both files, stacked them together, and drove to Sterling's office without calling ahead. He placed the 2 folders on Sterling's desk, without offering a single comment. Then he sat down in the chair across from him and waited. Sterling opened the first folder, the newer one, the Mercer family file Barrett had put together over the past 2 weeks. He flipped through it. Then he opened the second folder, the old file labeled Vaughn. The first page was a copy of a police report. The second page was a hospital record. The third page was a still image taken from the shipyard security camera. Blurry, black and white, but clear enough to show the shadow of one man carrying another man on his back through a smoking iron door. Sterling looked at that picture for a very long time. 11 years earlier, the Delaware riverfront, in the old shipyard district. Sterling was 22 years old, not yet a boss, not yet anyone at all, only a low-ranking hand in the organization, trying to climb by doing more than he asked. That night, Sterling had gone to the shipyard under the orders of a man he trusted, the man who had brought him into the organization, the man who had said, "I'll watch your back." But when Sterling stepped into the workshop, the iron door closed behind him, the click of a lock, the sound of footsteps walking away, then the smell of smoke. An old workshop, a wooden frame, machine oil soaked into the floor for decades. The fire spread faster than Sterling could understand what was happening. He ran to the door, pounded on it, called out, then pounded again, locked from the outside. The smoke grew thicker, hotter, burning his eyes until he could barely open them. Sterling fell to the floor, Crawled toward the wall, searched for a window. There wasn't one. Searched for a way out. There wasn't one. He lay close to the floor, where there was still air enough to breathe, and for the first time in his life, he thought he would die at 22 years old, in a workshop where no one even knew he was inside. Dale Mercer was working the night shift in the workshop next door. A mechanic, 36 years old that year. Not a tall man, but broad-shouldered, his hands calloused from wrenches and bolts. Dale heard pounding from the workshop beside his. Everyone else who heard it thought it was machinery. Dale heard it and ran over with a hammer in his hand. He broke the iron door lock with 4 swings. Smoke rushed out, so hot Dale had to step back, pull his shirt up over his nose, and then charge inside. He found Sterling lying close to the floor, nearly unconscious, his clothes scorched at the sleeve. Dale pulled Sterling up, lifted him onto his shoulder, and ran for the door. He carried him across the parking lot, set him down on the ground, called an ambulance, then sat beside him. He didn't ask who Sterling was, didn't ask why he had been inside the burning workshop. He only sat beside him, one hand on Sterling's shoulder, keeping him awake, until the sound of ambulance sirens cut through the night. Sterling woke up in the hospital 2 days later. His hands were bandaged, his lungs hurt, and his eyes stung from antiseptic. He had someone find Dale Mercer. They found him. Sterling sent $40,000, along with a thank you letter written by an assistant. 2 weeks later, the envelope was returned. Inside, the money was intact, not a single bill missing. Along with it was a small scrap of paper torn from a notebook, written by hand in dark blue ink, the letters slightly slanted, like the handwriting of someone who wrote fast but with certainty. You don't owe me. Live in a way that's worthy of that life. Sterling kept that scrap of paper for 11 years, in a locked drawer, along with one other thing he never let anyone see. Now, in the office, Sterling looked at the old security camera image, then at Joe Mercer's file, then at Barrett. He pulled me out of the workshop, Sterling said, his voice flat, as if he were reading the name of a street. Barrett nodded faintly. I know. He's dead. I know. Silence. Sterling looked down at the file, at the line listing Dale's occupation, shipyard mechanic, and beneath it, the line listing his surviving relatives. Jolene Mercer, daughter, 27 years old. Blythe Mercer, daughter, 8 years old. His daughter was counting coins to buy milk at 4 o'clock in the morning, Sterling said. Barrett didn't answer. He knew when Sterling was speaking to him, and when Sterling was speaking to himself. This was the second kind. That night, Sterling returned to the penthouse. The 30th floor apartment looked out over the Delaware River, where 11 years earlier, Dale Mercer had carried him through a smoke-filled parking lot. The penthouse was so clean, it looked like a showroom, with no family photographs, no keepsakes, no sign that anyone had ever lived there or was living there now. The refrigerator held 1 bottle of water and 1 carton of black coffee. The bed was always neat because Sterling slept 4 hours and woke before the sheets had time to wrinkle. Sterling sat down at the desk and opened the locked drawer. Inside were only 2 things. A scrap of paper written by hand in blue ink, the strokes bold, folded and unfolded, so many times that the creases had grown thin, almost ready to tear. And a photograph. Connor Vaughn, 14 years old, wearing his school basketball jersey, number 12, smiling wide, one hand lifting the ball high as if he had just won the most important game of his life. On the back of the photograph, in a child's handwriting, "Big brother, look, I can jump the highest in my class." Sterling placed Connor's picture on the desk beside Dale's note. He opened his laptop, searched through old emails, and it took nearly 10 minutes to find it. A video recorded on a phone, shaky, badly lit, with a crackling microphone. Connor was playing basketball on the school court, jumping to shoot, missing, laughing, picking the ball up and shooting again. His laughter came through the laptop speakers, small, distorted, but unmistakably the laughter of a 14-year-old child who believed everything would be all right. Sterling watched the whole video, then he watched it again. 8 years earlier, Sterling had lost Connor because of people who were aiming at him. Connor had been with Sterling that day, when he should have been at home, when Sterling should have left him at home. Since then, Sterling had let no one come close enough to become a weakness. He built his empire with discipline and distance. He lived in an empty penthouse, because when something was empty, there was nothing more to lose. For 8 years, he hadn't spoken Connor's name aloud in this room. Tonight, Sterling looked at Connor's photograph, looked at Dale's note, and said softly, just loud enough for himself to hear. "I saw it, Connor." The room didn't collapse. The air didn't change. But the two things on the desk, the photograph and the scrap of paper, were placed beside each other under the light for the first time, instead of being hidden inside a locked drawer. The only two things in this penthouse that carried any trace of human life. And the man sitting between them understood that 11 years ago, a mechanic had given him a life. Now, that mechanic's daughter was counting every coin to buy milk for her sister. And Sterling Vaughn, for the first time in many years, didn't know whether writing a check would be enough. The fourth week began with a call from the school. Jo was washing dishes at the restaurant, her day shift almost over, when the cheap phone she had bought with her first week's wages vibrated in her apron pocket. An unknown number. Jo dried her hands and answered. The voice belonged to a middle-aged woman, polite and professional. "I'm calling from the elementary school, Blythe attends. We need to discuss Blythe Mercer's guardianship records." Jo stepped out through the restaurant's back door and stood in the alley, her back against the brick wall. The woman explained that Blythe's enrollment file listed Patrice Dolan as her guardian. The school had called Patrice's contact number many times, but no one had answered. The school needed to confirm who was legally responsible for Blythe. Otherwise, under the rules, they would have to notify social services. Jo held the phone and looked down at her shoes, still wet with dishwater, and for a few seconds, she couldn't say anything. "I'm Blythe's older sister," Jo said. "I'm taking care of her." "We understand," the voice on the other end said, "but you aren't listed in the file. We need legal guardianship documents." Jo hung up, asked to leave 15 minutes early, picked up Blythe, and went home. That night, Blythe sat drawing on the mattress, knowing nothing. Jo sat at the folding table, staring out the window without really seeing anything at all. 2 days later, the apartment doorbell rang. Jo opened the door and saw a woman with short hair, around 40, holding a folder and wearing an employee badge. Lena Marsh, Social Services. Lena looked into the apartment over Jo's shoulder. Clean. The mattress folded neatly in the corner. A folding table, 2 plastic chairs. The refrigerator with a drawing taped to it. Old work gloves hanging on the door hook. Clean, but empty. The kind of emptiness that belonged to a place where people lived by willpower, not comfort. "Miss Mercer, I'm not here to make trouble for you," Lena said, her voice not cold, but not warm either. The voice of someone who had seen too many apartments like this one. "I need to confirm who is legally responsible for Blythe." Jo stood in the doorway, her hand on the doorknob, neither inviting her in nor sending her away. "I've been taking care of her for 4 weeks. Do you have guardianship papers?" Jo didn't answer, because the answer was no, and saying that word now could make her lose Blythe. Lena looked at Jo, not pressing, but not backing away either. "Miss Mercer, we need to confirm who is legally responsible for Blythe within the next 72 hours. If there's no legal guardian, we'll have to arrange another option for her." Another option. Jo understood what those 3 words meant. It meant Blythe would have to live somewhere else. It meant the 2 sisters would be separated. It meant everything Jo had held together for the past 4 weeks. Every coin, every night shift, every drawing on the refrigerator would no longer mean anything. Jo closed the door after Lena left. She sat down on the kitchen floor, her back against the refrigerator, exactly where she had sat 4 weeks earlier when she discovered Patrice had left. The last time she sat here, she had counted money. This time, she held her phone, scrolled through her contacts, and stopped at a name she hadn't called in 5 months. Agnes Mercer. Grandmother. The last time they had spoken was at her father's funeral, when Agnes had flown in from Savannah, dressed in black. Her eyes dry because she had already cried all her tears on the plane. After the funeral, Patrice had found a way to cut off contact between Agnes and the 2 sisters, and Jo had let it happen because back then, she had still believed Patrice would stay. Jo pressed call. The phone rang 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. Jo was almost about to hang up when she heard the receiver lift, then silence, then the voice of an older woman, slightly hoarse, cautious. "Who is this?" "Grandma, it's me, Jo." A very long silence followed. Jo heard Agnes breathing, heard a faint wind on the other side, as if her grandmother were standing out on the porch. Then Agnes asked, her voice held tight, not shaking, but thinner than usual. "Why didn't you call me sooner?" Jo closed her eyes, her head resting against the refrigerator door. Behind her, Blythe's drawing shifted faintly with the hum of the machine. The little house, the tree, the two sisters holding hands, because I thought I could handle it myself. Silence again. But this time, Joe heard Agnes cry. Not loudly, not for long, just one broken breath, quick, like someone trying to hold it in and failing. Then Agnes swallowed it down, breathed in, and her voice returned, steady, firm, the voice of someone who had learned how to stand back up after every fall. You did handle it yourself, Joe. For 4 weeks, you kept your sister with you. You worked. You found a way. That isn't failure. Agnes paused for a beat. Now you need more people. Those two things don't contradict each other. Joe said nothing. She only sat there, the phone pressed to her ear, her eyes closed, and for the first time in 4 weeks, she allowed herself not to be the only person holding everything together. 2 days after the call with Agnes, the apartment doorbell rang at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Joe had just brought Blythe home, and the two sisters were sitting on the mattress. Blythe opened her sketchbook, chose the yellow-colored pencil, and began coloring sunlight onto the roof in her new drawing. Joe stood up, walked to the door, looked through the peephole, and went still. Patrice Dolan was standing in the hallway, a small suitcase pulled close to her feet, her hair neatly tied back, a new coat on her body, looking like someone who had just stepped off a flight, not someone who had vanished for 4 weeks. Joe's hand tightened around the doorknob. Her first instinct was to slam it shut, but behind her, she heard Blythe's pencil making a soft scraping sound across the paper. If she shut the door hard, Blythe would look up. She would ask. She would know who was standing outside. Joe opened the door just wide enough to step out, then closed it behind her, gently, precisely, like closing the lid on a box that held something precious inside. The third-floor hallway, the flickering fluorescent light, the peeling yellow paint on the walls, the old damp smell. 2 women stood facing each other, less than 2 steps apart. Patrice spoke first. Joe, I want to explain. Joe looked at Patrice, not with the gaze of someone surprised, but with the gaze of someone who had expected this moment and had been preparing for it for a long time. $400, Joe said, her voice low, even, never rising. My father's life insurance was $87,000. You left $400. Patrice swallowed. I had circumstances. Old debts from before I married your father. I didn't know how to manage everything. Circumstances. Joe repeated the word as if tasting the bitterness of it. You want to stand here and talk to me about circumstances? Joe stepped 1 pace closer. Not to threaten her, but to make Patrice look straight into her eyes with nowhere left to hide. Do you know what Blythe asks me every morning? Every morning when she opens her eyes, the first thing she asks is, do we have to move out today? Every morning, Patrice, 8 years old. And that is the first question of her day. Patrice lifted a hand to her mouth. Joe didn't stop. Because you taught her that. You taught her that everything is temporary. Temporary housing. Temporary adults. Temporary promises. She learned that lesson very well. So well that she didn't cry when you left. Joe paused. Not because she had run out of words, but so the next sentence would have enough silence before it. Blythe didn't cry when you left, because she had already learned not to expect anyone to stay. 8 years old, and she had already finished learning that lesson. The hallway went silent. The fluorescent light flickered once, then steadied again, spilling white light over both faces. Patrice began to cry. Tears ran down both cheeks, her mouth pressed tight, her shoulders trembling faintly, the kind of crying that wanted to be pitied. Joe stood watching without moving. She didn't reach out. She didn't soften her voice. She didn't step back. You're crying now, Joe said, her voice not cruel, but leaving no room for softness. You're crying in front of me. But you didn't cry when you wrote that note at 3 o'clock in the morning and dragged your suitcase away while we were sleeping. Joe tilted her head slightly, looking straight into Patrice's wet eyes. Your tears only fall when someone is watching, Patrice, and I'm out of patience for watching. Joe turned away. Her hand closed around the doorknob, twisted, opened. Before stepping inside, she stopped, but didn't turn back. Don't knock on this door. Don't look for Blythe. If you truly want to do the one decent thing in everything you've done, then leave us alone. She stepped inside and closed the door. Gently, still gently, because Blythe was still sitting on the mattress, her head bent, coloring. Patrice stood alone in the hallway. The tears were still falling, but no one was looking anymore. She stood there for almost 2 minutes. Then she pulled her suitcase, walked toward the stairs. and disappeared for the second time. Inside the apartment, Jo sat down beside Blythe, calmly, as if she had only stepped out to get the mail. Blythe looked up, the yellow pencil held between two fingers. Who was that? No one important. Jo looked at the drawing. The small house, the triangle roof, the tree on the left, the two people standing in front of the door. The door had been drawn open, but there was nothing inside yet. "Draw some curtains," Jo said, her voice light, as if nothing had just happened. "Our house has to have curtains." Blythe looked at Jo, then looked at the drawing, then picked up the orange pencil and began drawing two small lines on both sides of the window. The little girl smiled, quick, half a smile, the kind of smile a child gives when she is testing whether it is safe to smile. Jo looked at that smile and thought, safe. At least for now. At least in this room. Out in the hallway, the sound of the suitcase wheels dragging over the tile floor had been gone for a long time. 36 hours after the call, at 5 o'clock in the morning, there was a knock on the door of the third-floor apartment. It wasn't the knock of a stranger. Not the knock of a debt collector or a social services worker. The knock was slow, steady, 3 times, then a pause, then 3 more times. The kind of knock that belonged to a patient person, someone who knew how to wait. Jo opened her eyes in the dark, lay still for 1 second to listen again, then got up from the mattress. Blythe was still asleep, curled into herself, her sketchbook tucked beneath one arm. Jo walked barefoot across the living room and looked through the peephole. Agnes Mercer stood in the hallway, her right hand holding the old cloth suitcase Jo remembered from childhood, her left hand holding a full brown paper bag, her eyes red, her back a little more bent than the last time Jo had seen her at her father's funeral 5 months earlier. 67 years old, 14 hours on a Greyhound bus from Savannah. No sleep, no transfers, just sitting in one place, watching America run past the window in the dark until Philadelphia station appeared before dawn. Jo opened the door. The two of them looked at each other. Agnes didn't hug her, didn't cry, didn't rush forward. She stood on the threshold, set the suitcase down on the floor, then looked Jo over from head to toe, slowly, carefully, the way a nurse checks a patient without needing the patient to name a symptom. Her eyes stopped at Jo's cheekbones, sharper than the last time they met. Stopped at her wrists, smaller now. Stopped at her eyes, still dry, still direct, but shadowed in a way 27-year-old eyes shouldn't be. "You've lost weight," Agnes said. Not a question, a conclusion. Jo swallowed. "I'm fine, Grandma." Agnes looked at Jo for 1 more second, the kind of look no lie could get past, then said simply, "Don't lie to me." Then she stepped across the threshold, placed the suitcase in the corner, set the paper bag on the folding table, turned back, and hugged Jo, not tightly, not crushing her, just wrapping both arms around her granddaughter's back and holding her, steady, even, like someone holding something that was about to fall. Jo went rigid for 1 second, exactly 1 second. Then her shoulders lowered, her head leaned into Agnes's shoulder, and she stood still inside her grandmother's arms without saying anything. She didn't cry, but she allowed herself to be held. The noise woke Blythe. The little girl came out of the bedroom, her hair tangled, her eyes heavy with sleep, her sketchbook still hugged against her chest. Blythe stood in the doorway, looking at the unfamiliar woman holding her sister. Then her eyes opened wider. Not unfamiliar. Agnes let Jo go and turned around. She looked at Blythe, and the first thing she did was sit down, slowly, her knees making a faint sound, until her eyes were level with her granddaughter's. "I'm here now, sweetheart," Agnes said, her voice gentle, the voice of someone who had carried that sentence through 14 hours on a bus, waiting for this exact moment to say it. Blythe didn't run. She stepped forward slowly, 1 small step at a time, cautious, the way a child walks when she has grown used to adults, making promises, and then leaving. But Agnes didn't leave. She sat there, still, waiting. Blythe stepped in front of her, stood still for 1 second, then wrapped her small arms around Agnes's neck and held on tight. Agnes placed her hand on Blythe's back and rubbed gently, saying nothing more. There was no need to say anything more. When Blythe let go, Agnes stood and looked around the apartment. The floor mattress folded neatly in the corner, the folding table, 2 plastic chairs, the refrigerator with a drawing taped to it, the little house, the tree, the 2 sisters holding hands, the newly colored orange curtains, Dale's old work gloves hanging from the door hook, the leather worn thin, still marked with machine oil on the index finger. Agnes looked at the gloves for a while, then at the drawing. Then she made no comment. She turned to the folding table and opened the brown paper bag. Inside was the food she had made in Savannah before getting on the bus. Egg sandwiches wrapped in foil, 2 juice boxes, and a small bag of butter cookies she had baked the night before she left. Agnes laid the food out on the table, took napkins from the bag, arranged 3 places, and didn't ask Joe where the kitchen was, didn't ask whether there were plates. She set out breakfast with what she had brought, on the folding table in the empty apartment, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Blythe sat down in the chair, looked at the butter cookie, then looked at Agnes. "Did you bake these, Grandma?" "Yes, last night." "You can't bake on a bus." Blythe smiled, small and quick. Then she picked up the cookie and ate. Joe stood beside the table, watching her grandmother and her sister eat breakfast, and thought that maybe, for the first time in 4 weeks, this apartment looked like a home. In the 5th week, Barrett called Joe. His voice was normal, professional, neither friendly nor cold. He said he had hired a family lawyer to help with the guardianship papers for Joe and Agnes, and that the legal fees had been paid through a charitable fund that provided legal support for women. Joe didn't need to pay anything. Joe listened, thanked him, and hung up. Then she sat at the folding table, looking at the phone. A charitable fund. A family lawyer. Fees already paid. Joe wasn't the kind of person who easily believed in coincidence. She remembered how her night shift had suddenly been changed to a day shift without anyone explaining why. She remembered how the 2 debt collectors had suddenly disappeared without anyone saying why. And now, a lawyer had appeared out of nowhere. The fee already paid, through a fund Joe had never even heard of. There was someone's hand behind all of it. Joe didn't know whose hand it was, until Thursday night. Joe got off work at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, picked Blythe up from school, brought her home to Agnes, then walked to the grocery store on Somerset Street to buy dinner. On the way back, she passed the old restaurant where she had once washed dishes on the night shift. Habit, a familiar route. But tonight, something was different. A black car was parked in front of the restaurant, the same kind of car Joe had seen once before, at 4 o'clock in the morning outside the convenience store, the night someone had placed a suit jacket over Blythe's sketchbook. The restaurant's back door opened. Sterling Vaughn stepped out. Black suit jacket, white shirt. The face Joe hadn't seen since that night, but hadn't forgotten. Beside him, 2 men in suits led a 3rd man out through the back door. That man didn't want to go. It was clear in the way he walked. Slow, shoulders drawn in, head lowered, but he still went, because the other 2 men gave him no choice without even needing to touch him. Joe stood still on the other side of the street, a grocery bag in her hand. She watched the scene for 10 seconds. Sterling didn't see her, but she saw everything. The next day, Barrett arranged a meeting at a small cafe near Center City for Joe to sign the guardianship papers. When Joe arrived, Barrett wasn't there yet. Sterling was sitting at a table in the corner, a cup of coffee in front of him, a folder beside it. He stood when Joe walked in. Joe didn't sit down. She stood in front of the table, looked straight into Sterling's face, and spoke without circling around it. "I saw you last night." Sterling's expression didn't change. He didn't flinch, didn't try to hide anything. He only looked back at Joe and waited. "In front of the restaurant on Somerset Street," Joe said. "You and 2 other men, and a man who didn't want to go, but still had to go." Silence. Sterling didn't deny it. He didn't explain either. He only stood there, his left hand resting on the back of the chair, waiting for Joe to finish. "You aren't a real estate businessman," Joe said. "You aren't someone who runs a charitable fund. I don't know exactly who you are, but I know enough." She drew a breath. "Do you think I'll let my sister grow up near a man like you?" Sterling looked at Joe, not angry, not offended. In his eyes there was only one thing Joe hadn't expected: acknowledgement. "You're right," he said. 2 words. No defense, no explanation. No story about Dale, about the burning workshop, about the blue ink note in the drawer. He didn't say, "But I helped you." Just 2 words, and they weighed more than any speech could have. Joe swallowed. She had prepared herself for an argument. She hadn't prepared herself for agreement. "Distance isn't enough," Joe said, her voice harder now, like someone trying to hold steady before her decision could begin to shake. "I need you to disappear." Sterling buttoned his suit jacket slowly, with one hand, the way he always did when ending a conversation. "The lawyer's fees have already been paid. The guardianship papers will be completed without my presence. Miss Mercer, I won't appear again." He gave a slight nod, not a farewell, only a confirmation. Then he walked past Joe, out the door, and disappeared into the crowded noonday street. Joe sat down in the chair Sterling had just left. His cup of coffee was still hot. The folder still lay on the table, the first page bearing Blythe Mercer's name. Joe placed her hand on the table and realized it was shaking, not because she was afraid, but because she had just driven away the only person who had helped her through the past 5 weeks without ever asking for a thank you. And being right, she discovered, was sometimes much lonelier than being wrong. The same week Joe drove Sterling away. Another blow came from a direction Sterling hadn't expected. Bryce Collier, his lieutenant of 9 years, the man who sat on Sterling's right in every meeting, the man who knew the safe codes, knew his travel schedule, knew whom Sterling met and where he met them. For 9 years, Bryce had built the image of a man absolutely loyal, but 6 months earlier, Bryce had begun talking to Marshall Keene, the boss who controlled the Southern port business, the greatest rival of the Vaughn organization in the Northeast. Bryce sold Keene one small piece of information at a time: delivery schedules, partner lists, financial figures, enough for Keene to build a complete picture of the Vaughn empire without ever stepping inside it. And when Bryce discovered that Sterling was spending time and resources on the Mercer family, a family with no connection to the organization, Bryce understood that it was leverage. He sold that information to Keene. Keene used it immediately. Barrett found the problem while reviewing a port transfer contract Bryce had submitted the week before. The numbers didn't match. The terms were written in a way that only someone who understood the structure of Vaughn Holdings from the inside would know how to draft. Barrett brought the contract to Sterling. Didn't say much, only marked 3 lines in red pen. Sterling read them, then read them again, then folded the contract closed. He called Bryce into the office and shut the door. Only 2 men were in the room. Barrett stood outside, listening through the thick wooden door, unable to hear the words, but able to hear the rhythm of a very short conversation. Sterling placed the contract on the desk and turned toward Bryce. 9 years, Bryce. Bryce stood in the middle of the room, not sitting because Sterling hadn't invited him to sit. His face didn't change right away, but his eyes did. The eyes of a man who knew he had been found out and was calculating how many seconds he had left to find a way out. 9 years I stood behind you, Bryce said, his voice neither apologizing nor defending, only stating a fact, like a man reading an itemized statement before signing it. Not once did you ask me what I wanted. Sterling looked at Bryce for a very long time. Not angry, not sad. His eyes held something worse than either of those things. The cold understanding of a man who had been familiar with betrayal since he was 22 years old, inside a burning workshop. He pressed the intercom button. 2 men entered. Sterling said, still looking at Bryce, "Escort Mr. Collier out. He doesn't work here anymore." Bryce walked to the door, stopped for 1 second, as if waiting for Sterling to say something more. Sterling did say something more, but not what Bryce wanted to hear. "You won't see me again, Bryce. Not because I'm forgiving you, but because you're no longer important enough for me to spend any more time on. And that's the most frightening thing I can do to you." The door closed. Bryce vanished from the Vaughn organization after 9 years in less than 3 minutes. But the damage had already been done. Keene had enough information. And Keene played his final card that same day. Barrett received a call from Keene's lawyer at 8 o'clock at night. The message was brief. If Sterling didn't sign over control of the 3 main ports in Philadelphia, Keene would send the entire file on Sterling Vaughn's underground operations to the family court handling Blythe Mercer's guardianship case. His true identity, his real sources of income, everything. Barrett set the phone down and looked at Sterling. "You keep the ports, then you have to cut yourself off completely from the Mercer family. No contact, no support, no involvement, so Keene has no leverage. Or, you give up the ports. Keene has no reason to send the file anymore. But you lose 3 ports. The empire weakens by 1/3. Sterling stood at the office window, looking out at the city, his back turned to Barrett. The silence lasted almost a full minute. Then he said, without turning around, "Prepare the transfer papers." Barrett didn't ask again, but he asked another question, softer, almost a whisper. "Why?" Sterling turned back, looked at Barrett, and for the first time in 9 years, Barrett saw something in Sterling's eyes that wasn't calculation. Because 11 years ago, A mechanic pulled me out of a burning workshop without asking for anything. I owe him more than 3 ports. The next morning, Sterling signed over the rights to 3 ports to Marshall Keene. Black ink on white paper. 3 signatures. The Vaughn Empire lost 1/3 of its strength in a single morning. Barrett placed the papers into an envelope, sent them out, then sat across from Sterling in the silent office. No one said anything more, but Barrett looked at Sterling and understood that the man sitting in front of him today wasn't entirely the same man he had followed for the past 9 years. Something had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for a boss to sign away something he had spent 10 years building, because of a handwritten note in blue ink inside a locked drawer. In the 6th week, Joe's wages were enough to buy food and pay Mrs. Whitfield $10 each night, but not enough for the $850 in rent for the 2nd month. Joe had known that since the week before. She had calculated it over and over, turned every number that could be turned, and every calculation ended in the same place, short. The landlord called on Monday morning. His voice wasn't bad, wasn't good, only the voice of a man who considered rent to be rent, not something sentimental. "Miss Mercer, I'll give you 3 days. If the money isn't here by Thursday, I'll lock the door and hold your belongings until the payment is settled." Joe hung up and looked at the calendar on the wall. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, 3 days. She had 72 hours and $120 in her coat pocket. The first thing Joe did wasn't look for money. The first thing she did was knock on Mrs. Whitfield's door Wednesday afternoon, 1 day before the deadline. She asked the old woman to keep Blythe that night and the next morning, saying Joe had to deal with the housing situation. Mrs. Whitfield didn't ask what had happened. She only nodded and then opened the door wider. Blythe stepped into her room with her pillow, her sketchbook, and the unfinished ball of yarn, waving to Joe through the doorway. Joe waved back, smiled, and waited until the door closed before turning away. Thursday morning, the landlord arrived on time. He brought a locksmith with him. Joe stood in the 3rd-floor hallway, her backpack on her shoulder, watching the locksmith change the apartment lock. Behind that door was everything she had. Blythe's clothes, the mattress, the blankets, the drawing on the refrigerator, her father's work gloves hanging from the door hook, and the guardianship papers the lawyer had sent the week before. The landlord locked the new door, slipped the key into his pocket, and looked at Joe. "Call me when you have the money. I'll keep the belongings as they are." Then he went down the stairs, his footsteps echoing on the wooden steps, then fading away. Joe stood alone in the hallway. 7 o'clock at night. The fluorescent light flickered. She sat down on the stair, her back against the iron railing, opened her backpack, and took out the cheap phone. She scrolled through her contacts and stopped at a name she had said she would never call again. Barrett Crane. She remembered telling Sterling, "I need you to disappear." She remembered Sterling nodding and walking away. She remembered her hand shaking when he left the cafe. Now her hand was shaking again, but for a different reason. The guardianship papers were behind the locked door. Without the papers, the court hearing couldn't happen. Without the hearing, Blythe would have to live somewhere else. Joe pressed call. Barrett answered after 2 rings. Joe spoke briefly, without telling a long story, without explaining too much. "I've been locked out of the apartment. My things are inside. The guardianship papers are inside. I need to get them back." Barrett didn't ask where she was. He had had the address for a long time. "Stay there. 45 minutes. 40 minutes later, Joe heard footsteps on the stairs. Not Barrett. Barrett appeared afterward, holding his phone, climbing to the 3rd floor with the face of a man already solving the problem in his head before he reached it. But the man who came up before Barrett was Sterling Vaughn. Black suit jacket, white shirt, leather shoes whose every step against the old wooden floor sounded firm and clear. The driver and 1 other man were waiting at the end of the street. Joe couldn't see them, but she knew they were there, because Sterling Vaughn didn't go anywhere without someone waiting at the end of the street. Joe stood up from the stair. The 2 of them looked at each other in the narrow hallway. The last time they met, Joe had said, "I need you to disappear." Sterling had disappeared, and now he was standing here, in the 3rd-floor hallway of an old building in Kensington, at 8 o'clock at night, because Joe had called his lawyer. Sterling didn't say, "What did I tell you?" He didn't say, "Now you see." He only looked at the locked door, then at Barrett, then nodded. Barrett called the landlord. Joe couldn't hear the whole conversation clearly, but she heard Barrett's voice, steady, clear, professional, and she heard the landlord's voice change from hard to soft, very quickly. Barrett solved it in 1 hour. The landlord came back, opened the lock, accepted a cash envelope from Barrett containing 2 full months of rent, and left without looking back. The door opened. The belongings were intact. The drawing was still taped to the refrigerator. Dale's gloves were still hanging on the hook. The guardianship papers lay on the folding table, exactly where Joe had left them. Joe stepped inside, put the papers into her backpack first, then took Blythe's clothes, then the rolled-up sketchbook, then the gloves. She didn't take the mattress, didn't take the blankets. She took only the important things. She turned back and looked at Sterling, who was standing outside the door, not stepping in. "I'm not staying here," Joe said. "The landlord locked the door in front of me once. I won't stay in a place where the door can be locked at any time." Sterling looked at Barrett. Barrett nodded, took out his phone, and began searching. Within 2 hours, Barrett found another apartment, smaller but in a safer neighborhood, a 10-minute walk from Blythe's school. 2 months paid in advance, under the name of a housing support fund. Joe knew where the money came from. She didn't ask, because asking right now was a luxury she didn't have the strength to endure. When the belongings had been moved into the new apartment, when Barrett had left, when only Joe and Sterling remained standing in front of the new apartment door in a cleaner, quieter hallway, Sterling took off his coat. A black tailored suit jacket, the kind of fabric Joe knew cost as much as 3 months of her rent. He folded the jacket and handed it to Joe. Directly, not setting it down, not leaving it on a chair or on the doorstep. He offered it with both hands, at eye level, like a man giving something both of them knew meant more than a coat. "It's cold," he said, only 2 words. Joe looked at the coat, looked at Sterling, looked at his hands, the hands of a man who controlled a city, holding the coat and waiting for a 27-year-old girl to decide whether to accept it. Joe took the coat, draped it over her shoulders. The fabric was heavy, immediately warm, carrying the scent of expensive cologne Joe didn't know the name of. Then she spoke, softly, quickly, like someone throwing out a word before she could swallow it back. "Thank you." 2 words. The first time Joe Mercer had ever said those 2 words to Sterling Vaughn. And those 2 words, in the quiet hallway of a building she had moved into 10 minutes earlier, weighed more than any speech, any vow, any contract Sterling had ever signed. Sterling nodded. Once, then he turned away, walked down the stairs, and went out into the dark street. Joe stood at the door, watching his shadow fade along the sidewalk. A man walking through Kensington at 10 o'clock at night, alone, in a black suit without a coat, his back straight, his steps even, afraid of nothing. And Joe thought of her father. Dale Mercer had been the same way. That night at the shipyard, hearing pounding on a door, running over with a hammer in his hand, unafraid, asking nothing, only walking into danger because someone needed help. Sterling Vaughn and Dale Mercer were 2 completely different men, but there was one thing they shared. They stepped into places no one wanted to go without needing anyone to tell them. Joe closed the door of the new apartment. Then she walked up 2 floors, over to the old building, and knocked on Mrs. Whitfield's door. Blythe opened it, wearing her pajamas, holding the unfinished ball of yarn, her eyes bright. "Joe, Mrs. Whitfield taught me to knit 4 rows. Joe smiled and bent down to hug her. "Good job. Come on, we're going to our new home. It's closer to school." Blythe tilted her head. "Why are we moving?" "Because I found us a better place." Blythe didn't ask anything else. The little girl picked up her pillow, her sketchbook, and the ball of yarn, waved goodbye to Mrs. Whitfield, then held Joe's hand and walked down the stairs. In the new apartment, after Blythe had fallen asleep on the clean mattress, Joe sat at the small table by the window, Sterling's black suit jacket draped over her shoulders, and for the first time in 6 weeks, she felt warm without having to make warmth out of willpower. The new apartment was quieter, cleaner, closer to the school. Blythe liked the small bedroom with a window looking out at an old maple tree that had lost almost all its leaves. Every morning, she stood in front of the window and counted how many leaves were still left on the tree, then ran off to school. During the first 3 days in the new home, Blythe drew every night, sitting on the mattress, her sketchbook open on her lap, her pencil moving across the paper, her head tilted, the tip of her tongue sticking out a little whenever she colored a straight line. Agnes sat beside her, knitting a scarf. Joe washed dishes in the kitchen. The apartment had a rhythm. Then that rhythm stopped. On Wednesday afternoon, Joe picked Blythe up at the school gate. Blythe came out with her backpack on her shoulders, her eyes lowered, saying nothing. Normally, Blythe would talk about the drawing lesson in art class, or the girl who sat beside her, or the squirrel she had seen in the schoolyard. Today, Blythe walked beside Joe in silence, her hand gripping the backpack strap tighter than usual. Joe asked, "Did you learn anything fun today?" Blythe shook her head. She didn't say why. Joe didn't push. That night, Blythe didn't open her sketchbook. She sat on the mattress, hugging her pillow, staring out the window at the maple tree in the dark. The sketchbook was in her backpack. The backpack was in the corner of the room. Blythe didn't touch it. The second day was like the first. The third day was like the second. The sketchbook lay still inside the backpack for 3 days in a row. Joe noticed it on the second night, when she saw the backpack still zipped shut in the corner. Blythe had drawn every day since she was old enough to hold a pencil. Drawing was how Blythe processed the world around her. When she was happy, Blythe drew houses with sunlight. When she was sad, Blythe drew trees without leaves. When she was scared, Blythe drew high walls. But when Blythe stopped drawing, it meant the world had become larger than anything a pencil could hold. Joe called the teacher during her lunch break on the third day. When the teacher heard Joe's question, she was quiet for a moment, then spoke carefully. "Last Wednesday, a group of children in class said unkind things about Blythe's family situation. I wasn't present at the time. The teaching assistant reported it to me after recess." Joe gripped the phone tightly. "What did you do?" "We spoke privately with that group of children, and we called the contact number in the file to notify the parent." The teacher paused for a beat. "The contact number in the file belongs to Mrs. Patrice Dolan. We called many times, but no one answered." Joe closed her eyes. The school file still listed Patrice as the guardian. Patrice had disappeared 6 weeks earlier. The school had been calling into emptiness, and Blythe had sat in class, hearing those cruel words, knowing no one was coming. "I'll update the school with a new contact number," Joe said. "And please, teacher, next time anything happens involving Blythe, call me." Joe hung up and sat at the kitchen table, looking at Blythe's backpack in the corner of the room. The sketchbook was inside it, silent, like something that had gone out. On the evening of the third day, after Agnes finished washing the dishes and sat down in her chair to knit, Joe walked to the corner of the room, opened Blythe's backpack, took out the sketchbook, took out the box of 12 colored pencils, and placed both in front of Blythe on the mattress. Blythe looked at the sketchbook, looked at the pencils, then looked at Joe. Her eyes weren't sad in the way adults are sad. Her eyes were empty, like someone who had moved everything out of a room and didn't yet know whether she should move back in. "You don't have to talk," Joe said, sitting down beside her. "You don't have to tell me what happened. You only need to draw." Blythe looked at the sketchbook. 1 minute passed. Then her hand reached out slowly and picked up the gray pencil. She hesitated for a long moment before the first line touched the paper. Blythe drew a house. But this time, it was different from the drawings before. The house had a tightly closed door, and on the door, she drew a large lock, clear, dark, firmly outlined, as if it were the most important thing in the picture. Inside the house, through a small window, Blythe drew 3 people, one tall person with long hair, standing in the middle, one small person standing beside her, holding the tall person's hand, one older person standing behind them, with a hand resting on both their shoulders. Joe, Blythe, Agnes. Outside the house, Blythe drew nothing. No tree, no sunlight, no people. Only white empty space surrounding the locked house. Joe looked at the drawing, looked at the large lock on the door, looked at the 3 people inside, and understood. Blythe was drawing boundaries. Who was allowed in? Who had to stay outside? Who was safe? Who wasn't? Joe placed her hand on Blythe's back and pulled her into her arms. Blythe didn't cry. She only leaned her head against her sister's shoulder, her hand still holding the gray pencil, as if holding on to it was enough. "No one has the right to say you don't have a family," Joe said, her voice gentle, steady, one word at a time. "Because you have me. You have Grandma. That is family." Blythe said nothing, but she didn't let go of the pencil. And that night, before going to sleep, Blythe taped the new drawing to the refrigerator. Beside the old one, the house with the orange curtains. 2 houses side by side, one with an open door, one locked tight. Agnes looked at the 2 drawings from her chair in the kitchen, then looked at Joe. The 2 women understood the same thing without needing to say it aloud. That night, After Blythe had fallen asleep, and Joe had gone to take a shower, there was a knock on the door of the new apartment. Soft, 3 times. Then a pause. Agnes was sitting in the kitchen chair, knitting a scarf, the ball of red yarn resting in her lap, the needles tapping in an even rhythm. She set the needles down, stood up, and walked to the door. She looked through the peephole. A tall man in a black suit stood alone in the hallway. Agnes had never met this man before, but she knew who he was. Joe had told her. Not much, because Joe wasn't the kind of person who told much, but enough for Agnes to piece it together. The man at the convenience store at 4 o'clock in the morning. The man who changed Joe's shift. The man who paid Vic Harlan's debt. The man who found the new apartment. The man Joe had driven away and then had to call back. And also the man Joe had said this about. He's dangerous, Grandma. Agnes opened the door. Sterling Vaughn stood in the cleaner hallway. Cleaner than the old one, where the lights didn't flicker and the walls weren't peeling, but it was still the hallway of a building where a man like Sterling Vaughn didn't belong. He looked at Agnes, and Agnes looked at him. They had never met, but that first moment lasted long enough for both of them to measure the other. Sterling saw a woman of 67, her gray hair pinned neatly back, her spine slightly bent, her eyes bright and hard, the kind of eyes that weren't impressed by expensive suits or polished leather shoes. Agnes saw a man of 33, tall, lean, sharp-faced, cold-eyed. But beneath that coldness, there was something she had seen many times in her 30 years as a school nurse. She had seen it in the most aggressive children, the most troublesome children, the children no one wanted to sit beside. Behind too much toughness, there was always a child pretending he didn't need anyone. "Did she call you?" Agnes asked, knowing the answer but asking anyway. Sterling shook his head slightly. "She called my lawyer." Agnes nodded slowly. "That's very different." Then she stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in." Sterling crossed the threshold. The apartment was small, clean, sparsely furnished, with a mattress in the bedroom, a small table by the window, 2 drawings taped to the refrigerator, and the old gloves hanging from the door hook. Sterling looked at the gloves, the leather worn thin, the machine oil mark on the index finger. He recognized them at once as Dale Mercer's gloves, because he had read it in the file, shipyard mechanic. The gloves of the man who had saved his life were hanging from the door hook of the apartment where that man's daughter now lived. Agnes didn't invite Sterling to sit with words. She went into the kitchen, took out 2 cups, set them on the table, and poured tea from the pot already made. She didn't ask Sterling what he drank. Didn't ask whether he wanted tea. She set the cup in front of him and sat down in the chair across from him, both hands wrapped around her own cup. Sterling sat down, his back straight, his hands resting on the table, not touching the cup. The 2 of them sat facing each other at the small table in the apartment Sterling had paid for and Agnes lived in. "The girl says you're a dangerous man," Agnes said, her voice level, not judging, only stating a fact. Sterling looked at Agnes. "She isn't wrong." "I know she isn't wrong," Agnes said. "I've lived long enough to know what dangerous men look like." She took a sip of tea. "But you're standing here at 9 o'clock at night because my granddaughter lost her home. Dangerous men usually don't do that." Sterling didn't answer. He looked down at the cup of tea, then across at the refrigerator, where Blythe's 2 drawings were taped side by side, the one with the orange curtains, the one with the locked door. Agnes followed his gaze. "My granddaughter draws every day," she said. "Ever since she learned how to hold a pencil. Dale was the same way when he was little. He drew on the walls, on the floor, even on his school bag. I punished him over and over, but it never stopped." Dale's name fell into the room lightly, like a leaf, but Sterling heard it as something heavier than anything he had heard all week. He said nothing. Agnes looked at him, then asked, her voice ordinary, as if she were asking about the weather, "Do you still have the note he wrote?" Sterling nodded. "Once." He said nothing more. Agnes set her teacup down on the table. Her fingers tightened around the porcelain, not from weakness, but because she was sitting across from a stranger and hearing him confirm that he had kept her son's handwriting for 11 years. Her son had died 5 months earlier in an accident at the shipyard. But 11 years before that, her son had saved a man's life, and that man had kept Dale Mercer's handwriting in a locked drawer longer than she had kept Dale's photographs in a shoebox. "His handwriting was terrible," Agnes said, her voice soft, a little hoarse, like someone saying a sentence she had said 1,000 times in her life, except this time it weighed more than all the others. From the time he was small until he was grown, His writing looked like chicken scratches. His third-grade teacher called me to the school and said Dale wrote so badly nobody could read it. I went home and made him practice. He lasted 2 days, then quit. His handwriting stayed terrible until... She stopped. Not because she had forgotten, but because the next words were, until he died. And she didn't want to say them in a kitchen, with her granddaughter's 2 drawings on the refrigerator. Sterling sat still. His hands still rested on the table, still not touching the teacup. But the veins on the back of his hand stood out faintly, like a man holding something tightly inside himself. I couldn't read his note the first time, Sterling said, very quietly. I had to read it twice. Agnes looked at him. Her eyes were wet, but the tears didn't fall. She held them there, at the edge of her lashes, the way she had held things all her life. Twice isn't much, she said. I had to read his homework 3 or 4 times before I understood it. Then she laughed, softly, briefly, the kind of laugh only a mother who has lost a child can have, laughing because she remembers, laughing because it hurts, laughing because if she doesn't laugh, she will cry, and she doesn't want to cry in front of a stranger. Sterling looked at that smile, and something in him, something he had built walls around since the day he lost Connor, cracked. It didn't break, it only cracked. One small fracture, enough for the light from the kitchen to slip inside. A mother of 67 sat before him, talking about her son's terrible handwriting as if Dale were still somewhere, still writing chicken scratches on some scrap of paper, still saving someone in some burning workshop. And Sterling understood that the note in his drawer wasn't only a message. It was the handwriting of a son whose mother still remembered every stroke. Agnes stood and washed the teacups. Sterling stood too and buttoned his suit jacket. No one offered a formal goodbye. Agnes opened the door. Sterling stepped out. Before the door closed, Agnes spoke again, her voice still ordinary, the voice of someone telling the truth without wrapping it in sweetness. Mr. Vaughn, I don't know what kind of man you are. I don't need to know. But my son gave you something you're still carrying after 11 years. So keep carrying it, and live worthy of it. The door closed. Sterling stood alone in the hallway, listening to Agnes's footsteps return toward the kitchen, listening to the water running as she washed the cups, listening to the soft tap of knitting needles when she sat back down in her chair, the most ordinary sounds in the world, and also the sounds his 30th floor penthouse had never had. The 7th week. Joe went to Barrett's office in the afternoon to sign the final papers before the guardianship hearing. Agnes was at home with Blythe, the 2 of them cooking dinner together, Blythe helping rinse the rice, water splashing onto her apron, Agnes laughing. Joe went alone, holding the stack of documents Barrett had sent ahead by email, and that she had printed at the public library near Blythe's school. She arrived at Barrett's office, an old building in Center City, on the 4th floor, with a narrow hallway paved in black and white tile. The secretary said Barrett was in a meeting, and asked Joe to sit and wait in the hallway. Joe sat on the wooden chair, the papers on her lap, and waited. Then Barrett's office door opened. The person who stepped out wasn't Barrett. Sterling Vaughn came out, his white shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, no suit jacket, his face sharper than the last time Joe had seen him, dark circles under his eyes, his jaw clenched like a man who had just swallowed something bitter. He had just finished a meeting with Barrett about the aftermath of Bryce, about the 3 ports he had lost, about the numbers shifting inside the Vaughn empire. He hadn't had time to leave before he saw Joe sitting in the hallway. The 2 of them looked at each other. The last time they met, Joe had said thank you in the hallway of the new apartment. Before that, Joe had said, I need you to disappear. Before that, Sterling had placed his suit jacket over Blythe's sketchbook at 4 o'clock in the morning. All of those meetings put together still weren't enough to name the relationship between them. Joe meant to stand up and leave. Sterling spoke first. Miss Mercer, 1 minute. Joe stopped, not sitting back down, but not taking another step either. Sterling stood a few steps away from her, his back against the hallway wall, his arms folded across his chest. He looked down at the tile floor for a while, like a man searching for a way to say something he had never said to anyone. Then he spoke, his voice flat and even, as if reading a line from a report. I had a younger brother, Connor, 14 years old. 8 years ago, people were aiming at me. Connor was with me that day. He should have been home. He stopped. He didn't look at Joe. He looked straight ahead, at the wall across from him, like a man talking to himself while someone happened to be listening. For 8 years, I didn't say his name out loud. Not until I read your father's file. Silence. The clock on the wall ticked. Someone typed on a keyboard in the room next door. Ordinary sounds surrounding a story that wasn't ordinary at all. Live worthy, Sterling said, his voice still flat but slower now, like a man weighing each word before letting it go. I thought about that sentence for 11 years. Living worthy doesn't mean doing something grand. It means not walking away when you can. Jo stood in the hallway, the paperwork held against her chest, looking at Sterling. Her eyes were red, slightly, along the rim, the kind of red only someone looking closely would see. But she didn't cry. Dale Mercer's daughter didn't cry in front of other people. She didn't say, "I understand," either, because she didn't understand. She hadn't lost a younger brother. She had lost her father, and that had been painful enough. But she knew Sterling's pain wasn't something she had the right to say she understood. Instead, she said the thing Dale Mercer would have said if he were standing in that hallway. "My father would say you think too much." Jo said it softly, plainly, not trying to comfort him, not trying to heal him. He'd tell you, "Go do something useful." Sterling looked at Jo, and the corner of his mouth shifted, for 1/10 of a second, so fast that if Jo had blinked, she would have missed it. It wasn't a smile, but it was the closest thing to a smile that Sterling Vaughn could produce, and Jo, for a reason she couldn't explain, felt that it was enough. Then Jo looked more carefully, at the dark circles under his eyes, at the sharper cut of his cheekbones compared to the week before, at the way he leaned against the wall, not because of posture, but because if he didn't lean, his shoulders would sag. "You haven't slept in 3 days, Jo said, not a question. Sterling looked at her, slightly surprised, though he covered it very quickly. "That has nothing to do with you." Jo tilted her head, looking at him as if looking at a problem whose answer was too obvious. "Barrett is the only lawyer I have. If you collapse, Barrett quits. If you collapse, I lose my sister. So it has something to do with me." Sterling looked at Jo and said nothing. In 9 years, Barrett had never dared speak to him that directly. His men didn't dare. His partners didn't dare. A 27-year-old girl, a mechanic's daughter, stood in the hallway of a lawyer's office, holding a stack of papers she had printed at the library, and told the most powerful boss in Philadelphia to his face that he needed to go to sleep. And the strangest thing was, he didn't feel insulted. He felt something else, something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Someone saw that he was tired and wasn't afraid to say it. That night, Sterling returned to the penthouse 2 hours earlier than usual. He took off his shoes, turned off his phone, and lay down on the bed without checking his email. And he slept 5 hours instead of 4. 1 hour more. Not much, but enough that the next morning, when Barrett called at 6 o'clock, Sterling's voice was a little less sharp, and Barrett, though he didn't know what had happened in the hallway the afternoon before, understood that something had changed, even if he couldn't name it. The 8th week, Tuesday morning, Philadelphia's sky was gray, not raining but without sunlight either, the kind of sky that hung suspended between two things and refused to choose. The county courthouse stood on Market Street, an old building with a gray stone front, wide steps, and a flag moving faintly on the roof. People passed in front of the courthouse gates with coffee and files in their hands, walking fast, worried-faced, the kind of people used to justice moving more slowly than life. Agnes Mercer stood in front of the bathroom mirror in the new apartment at 6 o'clock in the morning, wearing the best gray sweater she owned, the one she wore to church in Savannah, the one she had worn to Dale's funeral. She smoothed the crease at the shoulder, pulled the sleeves down to her wrists, looked at herself in the mirror, and nodded once, like a person confirming to herself that she was ready. Jo stood at the bedroom door, wearing the dark blue dress Agnes had bought at the thrift store on Saturday. $12, still new, donated by someone who had never worn it. The dress was a little loose at the waist but fit at the shoulders. Jo zipped it up, looked down, then looked at Agnes. Agnes looked back, neither praising nor criticizing, only saying simply, "Straight back. Look straight ahead. Speak slowly." At the courthouse, before they entered the courtroom, a court assistant led Blythe to a room set aside for children. A small, clean room, with low tables and chairs, a box of colored pencils, drawing paper, and a few picture books. The assistant was a young woman, with her hair tied in a ponytail, and she smiled when Blythe stepped inside. "You like to draw? I saw you brought such a beautiful sketchbook." Blythe looked at Jo, waiting for permission. Joe bent down and smoothed her hair. "Stay here and draw with her, all right? Grandma and I will go inside for a little while and then come back out." Blythe nodded, sat down in the chair, opened her sketchbook, and chose a pencil. The assistant sat beside her and asked what she was drawing. Joe closed the door to the room, turned back toward the hallway, took a long breath, then walked into the courtroom. The courtroom was smaller than Joe had imagined. Fluorescent lights, wooden benches, an American flag in the corner, and Judge Helen Voss seated at the front, her reading glasses resting on her head, the file open before her. She had worked in family court for 26 years, and her face was calm in the way of someone who had heard too many sad stories to be surprised anymore, but had not become hardened enough to stop listening. Agnes and Joe sat on the left. On the right, Patrice's appointed attorney sat alone with a folder. Patrice herself wasn't there. She was still in Tampa, attending by phone, her voice coming through the small speaker on the attorney's table, thin and distant, like someone calling from a place that very badly wanted to forget. Barrett Crane sat in the row behind them, beside the aisle, a folder on his lap. He submitted Sterling Vaughn's written statement to the judge, confirming that Sterling had been with the Mercer sisters during the first weeks, had supported them legally through an aid fund, and had no claim of guardianship whatsoever. Sterling wasn't in the courtroom. He kept his promise to Joe. He disappeared. His statement was on paper, his signature at the bottom of the page, and that was all the presence he allowed himself in this room. Judge Voss read the file and asked Lena Marsh a few confirming questions about the condition of the apartment, Joe's income, and Agnes's presence. Everything followed procedure, calm and professional, until Patrice's attorney opened the folder and presented a piece of paper. "Your Honor, we would like to submit a police record showing that Miss Jolene Mercer was cited for taking food from a supermarket in Kensington without paying, just 12 days after Mrs. Dolan left." The courtroom went silent. Joe sat beside Agnes, her back straight, her hands resting on her lap. She knew that record existed. She knew it would be brought up. She hadn't told Agnes because she hadn't wanted her to worry. Agnes glanced at Joe for only a moment, then looked straight ahead, her face unchanged. Judge Voss read the record, then looked at Joe over the rims of her glasses. "Miss Mercer, would you like to say anything about this?" Joe looked at Agnes. Agnes didn't nod, didn't shake her head, didn't signal anything. She only looked back at Joe with the same gaze Joe had known since childhood, the gaze that said, "I'm here. Speak." Joe stood. The wooden chair made a soft sound against the floor. She stood upright, her hands at her sides, looked straight at the judge, and spoke in a low, clear, slow voice, one word at a time. "Your Honor, I took 1 carton of milk, 1 pack of noodles, and 1 apple without paying. I don't deny it. I paid a $50 fine. That was the last money I had that week." The courtroom was silent. Patrice's lawyer didn't interrupt. Judge Voss didn't interrupt. "My sister was hungry," Joe said. Not hungry like she had missed lunch. Hungry like she hadn't eaten anything since the day before. "I had gone to ask for work at 3 places that day. 2 places turned me down. The 3rd place gave me a night shift, but wages were paid on Friday, and that day was Tuesday." Joe stopped, not because she had run out of words, but so the next sentence would have enough silence before it. "I know taking things without paying is wrong. I'm not asking the court to excuse it. I only want the court to know this. If I could go back to that night, I would do exactly the same thing." She drew in a small, controlled breath, then said the final sentence. "Because between the law and my sister, I choose my sister. Every time." Joe sat down. Her hands rested in her lap, and this time they didn't shake. Agnes looked at Joe, then looked straight ahead, and in her eyes something lit up, not tears, but recognition. Her granddaughter had grown into someone she no longer needed to worry over. Judge Voss took off her glasses, set them on the desk, and looked at both sides. Then she asked, "Does anyone else wish to speak?" Agnes Mercer stood. No one invited her. No one granted permission. She stood on her own, her gray sweater, her straight back, her hand resting on the back of the bench in front of her, her voice steady. The voice of a woman who had spoken before parent councils, before school boards, before doctors, before everyone who needed to hear the truth and didn't want to hear it. "Your Honor, I'm Agnes Mercer, Blythe and Joe's grandmother. I took a 14-hour bus ride from Savannah to come here because my granddaughter called me at midnight and said she needed her grandmother." Agnes paused, looked at Patrice's attorney, then looked at the judge. My granddaughter took a carton of milk because her sister was hungry. The court has just heard my granddaughter speak. Now I would like to ask the court one question. Agnes looked straight at Judge Voss. The person who took a carton of milk because her sister was hungry, and the person who took $87,000 in life insurance money from my son and left my 2 granddaughters in an empty apartment with $400 and an apology note. Which one is the court questioning as unfit? The courtroom went silent. Patrice's attorney didn't object. Through the phone speaker, Patrice's voice went silent too, and for the first time in the hearing, she had nothing to say. Judge Voss looked at Agnes for a while, then nodded faintly, the kind of nod that belonged to someone who had heard enough to make a decision. She put her glasses back on, read the file one final time, then ruled. The court grants permanent guardianship to Mrs. Agnes Mercer and Miss Jolene Mercer as co-guardians, effective immediately, subject to periodic supervision as required under federal regulations. She turned a page. The sum of $38,000 recovered from Mrs. Patrice Dolan's personal account will be transferred into a trust fund for Blythe Mercer, managed by the Court Oversight Agency. She turned another page. Mrs. Patrice Dolan's file will be forwarded to the district attorney's office for review of related charges. Agnes took Joe's hand under the table. Her hand trembled once, only once, then held tight, steady, like someone who had finally touched shore after swimming for a very long time. Joe looked down at her grandmother's hand, blue veins raised beneath thin skin, the hand of a 67-year-old woman who had taken a 14-hour bus ride, who had cooked rice in an empty apartment, who had stood before a court and spoken the truth without needing anyone's permission. Joe held her hand back, tightly, and thought. 2 generations of Mercer women had just stood up in the same courtroom, and neither one of them needed to be saved. In the courthouse hallway, the white fluorescent lights shone down on the polished stone floor. Joe led Blythe out of the children's room, Blythe holding her sketchbook in one hand and her sister's hand in the other, her eyes bright after just showing the court assistant the drawing she had finished. Agnes walked behind them, carrying the small bag that held the paperwork, her back still straight, her steps still steady, though her eyes were wetter than they had been when she walked in. The 3 of them moved down the hallway toward the main staircase, and Patrice was standing there. She had flown back from Tampa for the hearing but hadn't been allowed into the courtroom because she was attending by phone through the arrangement made by her attorney. She stood near the stairs, her small suitcase close to her feet, her coat wrinkled, her eyes red, looking like someone who had spent the whole hearing sitting on a hallway chair, listening to everything echo through a closed door. Patrice saw Agnes, saw Joe, saw Blythe. She opened her mouth, but before she could speak, Agnes stopped walking. Joe stopped with her, one hand keeping Blythe behind her, naturally, without drawing attention, standing in a way that meant Blythe wouldn't have to face Patrice directly. Agnes looked at Patrice, not with anger, not with contempt. Her eyes were calm in the way of a woman who had spent her whole life seeing every kind of person and no longer had the energy to hate anyone. One day, you'll understand the true cost of what you've done, Agnes said, her voice even, neither rising nor falling, like someone reading a truth that had been written down a long time ago. I hope when that day comes, someone will be willing to listen. That person won't be me. Agnes walked past Patrice. Joe followed. Blythe followed Joe. No one looked back. Patrice stood alone beside the staircase, her mouth still slightly open, the sentence she had wanted to say still hanging on the edge of her tongue, but there was no one there to hear it anymore. Blythe had walked beside Joe for only a few steps when she stopped, not because she was tired, not because she was afraid, but because her eyes had seen someone at the far end of the hallway. Far away, near the emergency stairwell, Sterling Vaughn stood alone, his back against the wall, his hands in his pockets, black suit, white shirt, standing in a place no one passed through, a place only someone looking on purpose would notice. He hadn't entered the courtroom. He had kept his promise to Joe. He disappeared, but he had come. He had stood in the hallway throughout the hearing, 30 steps from the courtroom, unable to hear clearly, unable to see inside, only there, in the same building, under the same roof, at the same time. Blythe let go of Joe's hand and ran, not fast, but with the kind of running children do when they are going towards someone familiar, her small feet tapping against the stone floor, her sketchbook held against her chest. Sterling watched her run toward him, and he didn't bend down, didn't wave, didn't smile. He only stood straighter, moved his back away from the wall, and waited. Blythe stopped in front of Sterling, lifted her head to look at him. Then, without saying anything, opened her sketchbook. The newest page was drawn in colored pencil, the lines more careful than the ones before. The familiar house, the triangle roof, the tree on the left. But this drawing was different. Inside the house, through the window with orange curtains, 3 people stood together. 1 tall person with long hair, 1 small person, and 1 older person. Joe, Blythe, Agnes, and at the right edge of the page, far from the house, a lone figure stood apart. That person wasn't inside the house, wasn't under the tree, wasn't holding anyone's hand, but that person was in the picture. Blythe didn't say, "You're in here." She didn't say, "I drew you." She didn't say anything at all. She only lifted the sketchbook to the height of Sterling's chest and waited. Sterling looked at the drawing, looked at the house, looked at the 3 people inside, looked at the figure on the edge. He looked for a long time, carefully, the way he had read that handwritten note 11 years before, every line, every stroke. Then he nodded. Once. He said nothing. Blythe closed the sketchbook, hugged it to her chest, turned, and ran back to Joe. Joe stood 10 steps away, Agnes beside her. Joe had seen the whole thing. Blythe running to Sterling, the sketchbook opening. Sterling looking. His nod. Blythe running back. 10 steps. Joe didn't come closer. She didn't call Blythe back either. She only stood there, looking at the man at the end of the hallway, and the man looked back at her. No wave, no nod, just a look held long enough for both of them to know that something existed between them, something neither of them would name. Sterling turned away, stepped into the emergency stairwell, and disappeared. Blythe took Joe's hand again and asked, "Are we going home, Joe?" Joe looked down at her sister and smiled softly. "Yes, we're going home." A few days after the hearing, in the afternoon, Joe sat on the threshold of the new apartment, her back against the doorframe, looking out at the quiet hallway. Blythe sat beside her, her legs swinging, her sketchbook open on her lap, coloring a small flower in the corner of the page. Agnes was in the kitchen, the steady sound of knife against cutting board, drifting out as she prepared dinner. Joe looked at Blythe, then out at the hallway, then thought. She thought about the Kensington apartment, about counting coins at 4 o'clock in the morning, about the nights Blythe slept in the neighbor's room, about the hand that had put the peanut butter back on the shelf so she could buy the box of colored pencils. Then she thought about Savannah. She had never been to Agnes's house in Savannah, but she remembered Agnes telling her about it. The small kitchen, the window looking out at the backyard, the jasmine plant Dale had planted when he was 12 still alive. She looked at Blythe. "Hey." Blythe lifted her head, her pencil stopping in the middle of a line. "Do you like it here, or do you want to go home with Grandma?" Blythe tilted her head and thought for a while. The serious kind of thinking an 8-year-old does when asked an adult question. "Anywhere with you is okay." Joe looked at her, swallowed, then spoke, her voice soft but steady, the voice of someone who had already decided and was only now saying it out loud. "We're going home with Grandma, Savannah." Blythe looked at Joe. "Forever?" "Forever." Joe placed a hand on Blythe's knee. "But I promise you something. This is the last time we move because we have to. Next time we move, it'll be because we want to, not because we have to." Blythe looked at Joe for a long time, the way a child looks when she is deciding whether to trust a promise, because promises have failed her too many times. Then Blythe nodded. One firm, decisive nod, like someone signing a contract both sides knew mustn't be broken. Joe nodded back. Then the 2 sisters sat on the threshold for a little longer, Blythe returning to the flower in her drawing, Joe looking out at the quiet hallway one last time. In the kitchen, Agnes began humming softly, some old song Joe couldn't remember the name of, but whose melody she remembered from childhood, from summers in Savannah when her father was still alive and everything was still whole. 6 weeks after the hearing, winter came to Savannah with a light rain and a wind much warmer than Philadelphia's. Agnes's small house sat on a quiet street, paved with old brick, with rows of ancient oaks shading both sides of the road, their roots rising through the sidewalk like old fingers gripping the earth. It was a 1-story house, painted white, with a gray roof, and on the front porch were 2 wooden chairs Dale had built when he was 16. The paint had peeled, but they were still sturdy. In the backyard stood the jasmine plant Dale had planted when he was 12, still alive, still blooming in spring, still watered by Agnes every morning. Joe began working as an administrative assistant at a veterinary clinic, 15 minutes from the house on foot. Day shift, 8 o'clock in the morning to 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The pay wasn't high, but it was enough. And the word enough, to Joe now, was worth more than any number. Every afternoon, she walked home past the row of oaks, past the bakery on the corner, past Blythe's school gate, and reached the house just as Savannah's late afternoon sun turned golden across the roof. For the first time in her life, Jo Mercer had dinner with her sister. Not a hurried dinner between two shifts. Not dinner on a floor mattress in an empty apartment. A real dinner, at a real table, with her grandmother cooking, her sister sitting beside her. Yellow kitchen light overhead, the smell of hot food in the air, the soft clink of dishes. Normal, and normal, after everything that had happened, was the greatest gift Jo had ever received. On Thursday afternoon, Blythe came home from school and found a cardboard box sitting in front of the house. The box wasn't large, sealed with brown tape, with no sender's name written on it. Blythe looked at the box, then at Jo, then at Agnes. Agnes shrugged. Jo bent down and checked the shipping label. Sent from Philadelphia. No name, no return address, only a zip code and the city name. Jo knew who had sent it. She didn't say. Blythe opened the box. Inside were 12 children's books, arranged neatly. Drawing books, comic books, books about animals, and 3 books about architecture for children, the kind that taught how to draw houses, bridges, and cities, with watercolor illustrations that made Blythe's eyes light up the moment she picked them up. "Who sent these, Jo?" Blythe asked, holding the architecture book, her fingers turning each page, touching each drawing as if touching something precious. Jo looked at her sister, then looked at the shipping label again. "Philadelphia. Maybe someone thought you liked to draw," Jo said. Blythe didn't ask anything else. She carried the books into her room, opened the architecture book, sat by the window facing the jasmine plant, and began to draw. The new drawing, the familiar house, the triangle roof, the tree on the left. But this time, it was different from all the others. The house had open windows, curtains, front steps, and a small flower pot beside the door. The house had detail. It had depth. It had the trust that it would remain there longer than a month, longer than a season, longer than the time between 2 moves. When Blythe finished, she brought the drawing to Agnes. Agnes looked at it, nodded, then took tape and stuck it to the refrigerator, beside the photograph of young Dale that she had pulled from the shoebox as soon as the 3 of them arrived in Savannah. Dale at 20 years old, standing in front of the shipyard, holding a wrench, smiling wide, his eyes narrowed against the sun. Blythe's drawing and Dale's photograph sat side by side on the refrigerator, taped slightly crooked, imperfect. But there, in the same kitchen, belonging to the same family, in Philadelphia, that same afternoon, Sterling Vaughn sat in his office. Barrett placed a thick file in front of him, gray cover, the words printed across the front. Vaughn Foundation, 4-year activity report. 4 years of funding decisions Sterling had signed but had never read. Schools, community centers, child support programs, playground construction, book purchases. His name was on every check, but he had never stepped foot into any of the places he funded. Sterling opened the file, turned each page, read the name of every program. Slowly, 1 line at a time, like a man truly looking for the first time at something he had created but had never cared about. "Arrange for me to visit the center on Broad Street," Sterling said, without looking up. "Not to inspect it, to see what they need." Barrett looked at Sterling longer than usual, then nodded. On Sterling's desk, beside the foundation file, 2 things lay face up beneath the desk lamp. The photograph of Connor, at 14 years old, in his basketball jersey, smiling, one hand lifting the ball high, and the handwritten note in blue ink, the strokes bold, the creases worn thin, no longer hidden inside the locked drawer. There, on the desk, in the light, where Sterling saw them every day. In Tampa, that same day, Patrice Dolan sat in a lawyer meeting room at the detention center, waiting for her trial date. Her lawyer asked what she wanted to say in court. Patrice looked down at her hands, both hands resting on the metal table. No rings, no nail polish, only the bare hands of a woman who had nothing left to hide. "I chose myself instead of them," Patrice said, her voice neither defending herself nor asking for mercy, only stating a fact. Every time, I chose myself. No one applauded, no one forgave her, but it was the first true sentence Patrice had spoken, without needing anyone to believe her, without needing anyone to watch, without needing tears to fall at the right moment. It was only the truth, naked, late, and that was all. In Savannah, that evening, Blythe sat by her bedroom window, her sketchbook open on her lap, her pencil moving slowly over the paper. Agnes stood in the kitchen, stirring a pot of porridge, humming some song Jo remembered from childhood. Jo washed vegetables at the sink, water running over her fingers, cool and clean. The kitchen was small, warm, normal. 3 women, 3 generations, in a small kitchen in Savannah, doing the most ordinary things in the world. And the story ends here. Not with a grand moment, not with a vow or a promise, but with the sound of running water, the sound of pencil on paper, the soft humming of a grandmother in the kitchen. Sometimes living worthy doesn't mean doing something extraordinary. It means choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. It means putting the jar of peanut butter back on the shelf so you can buy a $4 box of colored pencils for your sister. It means taking a 14-hour bus ride through the night because your grandchild needs you. It means placing a suit jacket over a little girl's sketchbook at 4 o'clock in the morning, then walking away without needing anyone to know your name. It means signing away 3 ports you spent 10 years building because of a blue ink handwritten note from a mechanic who is no longer alive. It means sitting at the end of a courthouse hallway, not stepping inside, only being there, because sometimes presence doesn't need words. Life doesn't always give us stories with perfect endings, but sometimes it gives us enough. A warm kitchen, a sketchbook, and the people who choose to stay. That is our story today. If this story touched you, we would truly love to hear how it made you feel. Please share your thoughts in the comments below, from deep in your heart. Whatever you want to say, we're listening. If you found this story meaningful, please like it and share it with someone you believe needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next stories. Every day, we bring you new videos with the hope of reaching one small corner of your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace, and calm every day. Thank you for spending your time here with us. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.